We're delighted to say that this episode of Unbeatled is sponsored by Baz Luhrmann's new film, Epic, Elvis Presley in Concert. Out in IMAX today, February 20th, and in cinemas on February 27th. Obviously, Elvis is one of the reasons the Beatles picked up their instruments. Now, in true Unbeatled fashion, could you un-Elvis one of the King's songs for us?
Yeah, so one of my favourite moments in an Elvis tune is in Suspicious Minds, where for the bridge, there's just a massive change in tempo, time signature, vibe, but it just works so well. It creates the perfect night and day for the song. So it's at the end of the second chorus, so we have the "We can't go on together." Then we get, and then it goes into this, "Oh, let our love survive." And then we're in 6/8 time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Just completely different feeling. It almost feels like we've cut away to somewhere else. And then we work our way back into Caught in a Trap. So it's just this song was originally written and performed by a fantastic songwriter called Mark James, who also wrote Always on My Mind, which Elvis did the version of as well. But yeah, that's the thing about Elvis, is he was such a fantastic interpreter of music. His performance of Suspicious Minds is probably my favourite Elvis song, actually.
Now, we'll leave you with this, the full trailer to Epic, Elvis Presley in Concert.
Camera crew, gentlemen. All right. Glad you could be here. There's been a lot written and a lot said, but never from my side of the story. Don't be afraid to play. Just play it, man. Just play the hell out of it. Caught in a trap. I can't walk out because I love too much.
Epic, Elvis Presley in Concert in IMAX February 20.
It's coming to the end of 1968. Republican candidate Richard Nixon, standing on a ticket of law and order, has defeated Hubert Humphrey to become the 37th President of the United States. The M1 motorway has opened in the UK. African-American athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos have raised their fists in a Black Power salute after winning the gold and bronze medals in the Olympic men's 200 metres, becoming a defining image of Black Power and political protest. And Barbra Streisand has burst onto the scene as her film Funny Girl is released. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney is stressed, tired and fueled by drink and drugs. One night while sleeping, he is met by his deceased mother in a dream, where she consoles him and gives him some incredibly valuable words of advice. This is Unbeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. We examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician David Bennett unpicks the lyrics and music. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to Unbeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we take a look at Let It Be. So David, talk to us about Let It Be. You put on the record, what is it that you hear?
Well, of course, it's one of the most iconic piano intros of all time. Piano is often neglected in rock music, but the Beatles have a good handful of iconic piano tracks, and this is perhaps the most iconic. And something I find interesting about this song is that the chord progression, C, G, A minor, F, that chord progression, which is what we would describe as 1, 5, 6, 4 in sort of relation to the key. We're in the key of C, so that's 1. G is the 5 chord. 6, 4. That chord progression in the 90s and the 2000s will become a cliche. It will become so commonly used by sort of hundreds and hundreds of pop songs. But at this time in the 60s, it was quite an unusual chord progression, not sort of radical, but just not really gone to. So Paul, once again, sort of laying the foundations of what pop music would become in the future.
And that 4-chord song, I think there's a good parody of it, where someone is able to mash up just a whole range of incredibly popular hits from the last sort of 50 years, and they all sort of do that same musical sort of transition between the chords. So what is it about that chord progression, the Let It Be chord progression, let's call it, Why does it nestle into our brains and it is so listenable?
That video you mentioned, the comedy video, that's by a comedy troupe called The Axis of Awesome. And this chord progression is actually sort of known in sort of music theory circles as the Axis chord progression because of that. And you know, something I find quite interesting is Let It Be is one of the earlier examples, but the earliest example I've ever found of this chord progression in pop music is the song To Know Him Is to Love Him by Phil Spector, which of course is a link that we will talk about later. I think that's a pure coincidence that Phil Spector has sort of come from it, that angle and that angle. But why this chord progression is so effective is it's very major key, and it can sort of just loop round in a very satisfying way. But the thing is, Paul doesn't actually perfectly loop it. He, rather than going round and round sort of on an endless loop, he throws in this sort of iconic descending line. And it's very sort of churchy as well, particularly sort of gospel church. You can really hear it in this type of chord progression, and particularly it's very churchy. And when he then takes it and strings that bit out further, like that chord, B flat in the key of C, that's very gospel. So this song, I feel like Paul was trying to pull from that kind of gospel sound, and he actually pitched this song to Aretha Franklin before the Beatles had actually recorded it, and she did actually do a cover of it, which I'm sure we'll mention later.
Yeah, I was going to mention that further on in the show, but that brings me nicely to sort of the context around this song. James Paul McCartney, or Paul McCartney as we know him, was born on the 18th of June 1942 in the middle of World War II in the second most bombed city in the UK Blitz, with London obviously being the top. Liverpool was hit hard due to its industry and its dockyards. He was born to Jim McCartney, a Protestant cotton salesman, and Mary McCartney, a Catholic nurse and midwife. They were both of Irish descent, with Mary arriving in Liverpool at the age of 11 from Ireland. And she raised Paul and Mike with big aspirations for her boys. She pushed them on, and she notably wanted them to speak the Queen's English. She wanted them to speak properly. And I think Paul McCartney used to make fun of her. She'd go, ask. You've got to ask for something. And then Paul, in his feisty Liverpool accent, he'd be like, ask. He'd sort of joke with her. It was a warm, loving household by all accounts. Unfortunately, Mary McCartney died of an embolism, or a blockage of a blood vessel, shortly after an operation to stop the spread of breast cancer. She died on the 31st of October 1956 at the age of 47, when Paul McCartney was only 14. Obviously devastating, but at the time, Paul remembers himself saying, well, what are we going to do without her money? Which just sort of shows she was the breadwinner as well as being the mother. They sort of didn't know where they were going to look to next. Obviously hugely devastating. Now, 7 months after this event, Paul would meet John Lennon at the Woolton Village Fete after John had performed with his band, the Quarrymen. And a year after that, John Lennon's own mother, Julia, would be hit and killed by a drunk driver, an off-duty police officer, after leaving his Aunt Mimi's house. These two seismic events in their lives becomes the emotional bedrock, the bonding moment between Paul and John, which then sort of means that they can go through this hugely transformative, crazy whirlwind of a life, but they are always tied. They're always together emotionally. They've got that connection as well as a musical connection. They've got this emotional connection. Now, fast forward 10 years after Julia Lennon has died, the Beatles are the biggest band in the world. They're the biggest thing in pop music and music. They're getting compared to the classical composers of previous eras. Tensions are rife, though. They've been recording the White Album. There's squabbles. Ringo has walked out of the band. John Lennon's drug use is an all-time high. He's become addicted to heroin, with him and Yoko becoming inseparable. She sits in all the recording sessions now. Pretty much everyone, apart from Paul, is losing interest in being Fab, being one of the Fab Four. And Paul, with his sort of skills of negotiation, thought he could persuade the others to reconnect and get back to playing music together live in a room. something that would help rekindle their love of making music, as well as sort of being of the fashion to play sort of back to basics roots music. We can see with Creedence Clearwater Revival, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones' musical direction. But as I said, Paul is stressed, tired, drinking too much. I think the drugs are taking their toll, and it all felt like it was starting to unwind. So then this is where, according to Paul, he has a dream where his mother comes to him in a dream and reassures him it'll all be okay. These are all stresses. Let it be. Everything will be fine, my son. And that's the first line he wrote of the song. Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. So literally, straight off the bat, Paul is going through his hour of darkness, as he describes in the song. He enjoys being a Beatle more than the others. I think we can safely assume. He sees the grander vision, and he sees the power of the four of them together, being a man that's very great at marketing himself and the band, while the others are sort of seeking other creative outlets, or in John's case, seeking some sort of spiritual outlet, whether it's drugs or meditation. Paul, still being the de facto leader of the band, still sees the vision, still wants them to kick on. If that's not divine intervention, I don't know what is.
I know what you mean. Although, have you heard that Mal Evans, that the Beatles sort of assistant and confidant, has an alternative story about the vision?
Yes, I was going to entertain Paul's story first, and then I was going to bring up the Mal Evans, probably more viable story.
Yeah, and I think Paul has a habit of romanticizing how he comes up with songs sometimes, and fair enough. He's someone who's been quizzed and interviewed so many times. He's got to come up with good stories. But the Mal Evans recollection is that so we know that Paul first started writing Let It Be around the sort of White Album era, and apparently Mal Evans was in 1969 Mal Evans was driving Paul back from a late night session recording, and Paul told him about how when he was in India he had this sort of vision of Mal Evans, Mal came to Paul in a vision and was saying about sort of Let It Be, and Paul would start writing a song about Brother Malcolm, so still with a kind of religious tone there, but Paul said that he would change Brother Malcolm, that the lyric didn't really work, and of course we wound up with Mother Mary instead. So it might be a bit of both stories. It might have been that it started with this kind of vision in India of Mal, and then he kind of combined it with ideas of his mother as well to get the true kind of heart of the song. But I imagine Mal was a little bit peeved when the story got changed in post. But who knows? Who really knows?
That, as you said, Mal Evans has a different story, and it's corroborated with outtakes during While My Guitar Gently Weeps. They jam this sort of Let It Be blues number. It's got some of the words, it's got some of the melody, not quite there. Eric Clapton's noodling about on the guitar, and he's sort of beginning to sing Brother Malcolm Comes to Me, singing words wisdom let it be. So yeah, we can probably assume that it maybe did start as sort of a joke around Mal Evans, coming to them to support them as he always did. But with that sort of, as you said, that religious sound, that church sound of the song, I think Mother Mary obviously was maybe always in the back of his head. To become the actual.
Well, and didn't Mother Mary also influence Lady Madonna as well, which is once again religious iconography? The Madonna. So it's she's obviously a big influence in his mind, understandably. But yeah, I think also Paul probably, when he started getting interviewed about these things in the 70s or whatever, he probably didn't think that 50 years later people will be sat here dissecting everything he'd ever said. So yeah, fair enough that he wanted to sort of make the story a bit more interesting.
Yeah, if you got to have a good backstory. I 100% agree. Got to create the myth, the legend, the lore. That's why the Beatles have been so popular. They've got these myths, these legends that we are now dissecting. And when it comes to recording, he presented the song in the Get Back sessions. They were all calling it Mother Mary at the time. Although John really wanted to stick with the Brother Malcolm line, which we'll get onto as sort of it highlights John's not disdain for the song, but certainly not enthusiasm. John was never really a fan, even from the get-go of this song. It's worked out over a number of days in Twickenham Film Studios. Some takes are better than others. There's obviously tensions are rife during this, as we've spoken about before, but there is a sort of acceptance that they will have to play it, but no enthusiasm from George or John particularly. I can't really speak for Ringo. I feel like he was definitely the most amenable of the band, but
yeah.
George and John are certainly not giving Paul his due for the sort of song that would become. They don't see it as something that is particularly worthwhile of encouragement or their time.
You know, as far as Beatles tracks go, it's relatively straightforward and sort of just a simple sort of tune, almost akin to Hey Jude in a way. And I think that's why it's so universally popular. But especially at this point in the Beatles' career, I think John and George weren't interested in sort of simple songs anymore. They wanted something with a bit more grit and intrigue.
We'll go on to talk about the universal message of Let It Be is something that Paul was very good at, sort of conveying that our music for everyone. John at this time was starting to look inside himself. He was not far from his primal scream therapy, which would, produce all these amazing but incredibly personal songs such as God or Mother or Julia. Yeah. So John was looking into himself to write, and he wanted to just talk about himself. As he says in God from his first solo album, I Just Believe in Me, when Paul's probably taken this other approach of sort of a universal message, which I can imagine being sort of a point of creative tension between John and Paul. This is actually a song that leads to George quitting the band, because George and Paul are starting to argue about how much George should play on the guitar. Obviously, Paul sees it as a piano ballad that should build, obviously, into this guitar solo. So a lot of George's time is spent not really playing, and that causes him to sort of quit the band in the end. And they move the rehearsals from Twickenham Film Studios, as we've discussed, to their offices on Savile Row, and Billy Preston joins the band, which alleviates a little bit of the tension and takes a weight off their shoulders, lightens the mood. Although it doesn't always get much smoother. Paul exclaims at one point, "Right, back to the drudgery," and John shouts, "It's you that's making it like this," which Paul, with his sort of acerbic wit, diffuses by saying, the real meaning of Christmas, which you can hear in the sort of the Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary. Still running the song. Paul hasn't quite finished the lyrics, but they haven't worked out the arrangement just yet, so he's able to bumble along while the others make sometimes crude and sometimes silly suggestions. So they're not really taking it that seriously. And I do think it shows that it can be quite cruel, John and George and Paul to each other, although it's all done with this sort of face of business and comedy. But they're the digs are there, and they're quite mean-spirited.
Definitely. And it's easy in retrospect to think, oh, Paul, he's coming with one of the greatest songs of all time. I'm sure he just feels quite confident about himself. But in the moment, he's just written this tune. He probably doesn't know whether it's that good or not. And everyone else is just sort of not enthusiastic at all. It probably took quite a lot of self-motivation to actually get the thing recorded and actually push through and be like, no, this is a good song, and we are going to record it.
They finally get there after 27 takes of actually running the thing. Talk to us about what is happening in Let It Be, why it has become such a covered song, such a well-known song, and one of the Beatles' sort of defining masterpieces.
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, particularly for a Beatles song, it's relatively straightforward. We have this chord progression we were talking about earlier, which almost repeats, but then gets descending instead, the descending thing. So that's the whole verse, and then the chorus, we go to a different chord progression, A minor, G, F, and C, but then we just go back to where we were in the verse. C, G, and then the descending thing. And then the only other element we get musically is the sort of extended descending thing, where it goes down a couple times. So as far as musical material goes, there's not much going on. There's no middle eight, there's no pre-chorus or anything, which you would typically get in a Beatles song. But I think that is exactly what lends to this song's universal nature, why it can be treated almost like this hymn, because you don't have to learn that much material to learn it. You just string a few chords together. It's ultimately just 4 at a push 5 chords, and you've got the song. And that coupled with such a universal lyrical message means everyone, even sort of non-English speakers around the world, can really get to grips with this piece of music.
Yeah, I can vouch for that, because I play the piano badly, or as I say, I strum the piano, and Let It Be was the first song that I learned myself fully, because it was only a few chords. So if I
even the fact that it's in the key of C, which is all the white notes, that helps as well.
Can you talk to us about Billy Preston's contributions? Because he adds the organ to the song, and he sort of like just plays off Paul McCartney's piano piece, adds to that sort of religious church sound, but it also gives it a bit of soul.
The Hammond organ, which is what Billy's playing there, is iconically gospel church. It was literally invented to play the role of a traditional pipe organ in kind of smaller churches where they couldn't have that. So that sound, it comes from church, but of course it was fully adopted into blues and rock music. And Billy's adding that layer, but he's really not overplaying. He's not getting carried away. He's often just providing an extra bed of chords, particularly in the chorus, just sort of underneath things. And of course, he then also doubles the... And, it just provides another flavour to keep the song interesting. There's also, whilst we're talking about the sort of arrangement of the song, something I find quite interesting is that, as you mentioned, originally this song and this entire project, the Get Back project, was about getting back to playing as a live band and not doing overdubs. But in the end, this song actually wound up with a whole bunch of overdubs, partially just because the original take they did wasn't very good. So it's got, they replaced certain elements. They added a little bit of electric piano, Fender Rhodes piano, which I think Paul added. There's like a maracas overdub, and even Ringo adds extra drum fills and stuff with the toms, to the point that I think it's in verse 2. There's effectively 2 drum beats happening, so you couldn't play it as one drummer, but it doesn't sound wrong. It doesn't sound bad. So even if they were trying to get away from their studio habits of layering stuff and playing stuff that you couldn't perform live, they still couldn't help themselves in the end. They realised this song will be better served if we just add a few extra layers.
I think that's probably hearing the potential of the song and then going, right, it's probably not ready to be our last single, which is what it would become in the UK. But
true.
But understanding that it's a song that deserves to be out, and going back and adding George Harrison's guitar solos, which we'll talk about in the release. There's 2 different versions, but that's overdubbed. There's orchestration scored by George Martin, which is overdubbed. I believe Paul goes and redoes some of the bass because John was particularly sloppy, again showing his lack of enthusiasm. So as we discussed with George Harrison's guitar solos that were overdubbed, there are 2 versions of Let It Be, which we'll go on to discuss. There's the album version, produced by Phil Spector, and the single version produced under close supervision of Paul McCartney, but produced by George Martin. Now, George Harrison wasn't happy with his original take of the guitar solo, so he went and overdubbed 2 different types of guitar solos. One for the album, a little bit more cutting, a little bit more rocky, distorted, and one was recorded for the single through a Leslie speaker, which is literally a rotating speaker which tumbles up the sound. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Leslie speaker is usually connected with the Hammond organ, which we've obviously talked about. That's what Billy Preston would have been playing. It's literally a rotating speaker. The speaker contains a cylinder that is spinning around, and that creates this natural sort of wah-wah phasing effect, which is an inherent part of what we think of with the Hammond organ. But the Beatles loved putting other things through it. They put their voice through it, and on various songs during this era, they put the guitar through it. For example, they also put George Harrison's guitar solo on "Here Comes the Sun" through the Leslie speaker. But yeah, as you said, on the single version of this track, we get a Leslie tone on the guitar, which is, it's a really kind of like nice chorusy, thickening sound. And it's important to remember, at the time, guitar effects were actually quite rare. All of the pedals you would get soon in the 70s, all modern guitarists can think of all of their pedals and their pedal board that give different effects. At the time, that was really rare, and you basically had to get your effects either from the amp or through some sort of studio trickery, which is what they're doing here.
And also, with the song, in terms of overdubs, they did a few more overdubs of described literally in the notes as the oohs and the ahs.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so one of my favourite features of this song is the very simple but effective backing vocals that happen during the chorus, where the Beatles are just sustaining notes from the chords, just as oohs. And it's just layered up, and it creates this lovely sort of choral effect. And allegedly, there's also a layer in there provided by Linda McCartney, which makes sense to me because particularly later in the song, it does feel like you can hear a female voice in there. So it's I can imagine if they had the resources, they might have actually got like a gospel choir in or something, because that's the sort of vibe that they were leaning into. But I definitely think that they're channeling that sound compared to a normal, sort of a traditional Beatles BV. This is quite simple, but certainly very kind of choral.
That also adds up. I believe they tried to get Mary Hopkins, who they'd signed to Apple, to sing on the song, but that didn't happen in the end. And so they got Linda, and that obviously would take us to Wings and Paul and Linda, and her getting criticised for people saying she can't sing. She clearly can sing enough, a bit, and also, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but again, it's another criticism that John Lennon put to the song in 1980, on the year of his death, was that it wasn't a Beatles song. To be honest, it could have been Wings. Again, with Linda singing on the song, that sort of, adds up.
Yeah, well, and in the final recording, John is only providing vocals because his bass part was removed because it wasn't up to scratch. And he didn't do any guitar parts, so yeah, it's literally just his oohs and ahs on Let It Be.
It always had its original vision. We can sort of assume from Paul McCartney bringing it into Twickenham Film Studios, and it just took a while to get there. But they had different parts, different moments. It was sort of jumbled up a little bit.
Yeah, so the part that happens in the middle, where we have this descending line of the. That was originally used as an intro. We can hear that on the version that's on the Anthology 3 collection. And I believe that was recorded in early January 1969. So very close to actually when they cut the final version of the track. So they were playing around with it, they were experimenting. And that probably would have been a perfectly good intro. But, of course, we instead just got a rotation of the verse instead. But, even for the Beatles, usually you'd get some sort of like unique intro, think something like In My Life, where they've got a distinct part just for the intro. Here, they're just rolling out part of the verse as the intro. So, yeah, it's not the most typical Beatles song, really, despite being one of the most well-known and iconic.
Quickly touching on the lyrics we've already sort of spoken about before, it's a song with a universal message of, finding yourself in times of trouble, let it be, in hour of darkness, all will be okay. It's reassuring. Again, as you mentioned, it's probably why it's so popular in non-English speaking countries, which I think Paul has commented on when he's, especially in South America, I believe this song is massive because of, well, one, they're sort of more religious societies, and the basic words that can sort of be understood as a second language. The only thing I was going to comment also is that the term "let it be" is in Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, which Paul did at school. Oh, I could tell you, but let it be, Horatio, I am dead. And Paul thinks this has subliminally entered his mind and then into the song. And in terms of release, the song was released as part of the Let It Be album, but it was released as a single initially in March of 1970. By this time, the Beatles had broken up. They knew they were done. John had left the band the previous year. Paul's announcement would be teased a month after in the Daily Mirror in the UK. And yeah, the single version came out first. It was the last ever song released by the Beatles in the UK until we got to the 1990s anthology.
Yeah, well, it's quite poignant because, of course, it's just telling the fans, let it be, like, this is what it's going to be now, and it's quite interesting how they went into the Let It Be project, calling it Get Back, with this effort to get back to what they were and how things had been, not just from a musical perspective, but from a sort of group dynamic perspective. And in a way, the Get Back project sort of failed to achieve that, and instead it got rechristened as Let It Be.
And the Let It Be album version we've touched on. Again, Phil Spector produced that. The solo was more harsh. There was more prominent orchestral arrangement. And I think Paul wasn't particularly happy with Phil Spector's over-the-top sort of arrangement.
Yeah, his classic wall of sound approach, where it's just sort of big and potentially overly emotional. One of the most distinctive features, you can instantly clock the Phil Spector sound on Let It Be from Ringo's hi-hat sound. So if you're listening to the album version, it's got this little like echo sound on the hi-hat where it goes rather than just a straight sound. And it's not massive changes, but they all add up, and it becomes this sort of slightly sort of saccharine version of it.
There was actually a bootleg that was going around before this because somehow John Lennon's acetate of the Get Back sessions ended up in a disc jockey's hand. But discounting that, the first time that the public would have heard this song was actually by Aretha Franklin. Her album, This Girl's in Love With You, was released in January of 1970, so 2 months before the single was released. And again, it's tying into that gospel sound. It's got a great brass arrangement, huge soul gospel singers. It is one of the best Beatles cover songs, I believe. But yeah, it was the first time people would have heard it would have been through Aretha Franklin, and they might not have put two and two together.
Well, it's interesting how this song, more so than many Beatles songs, has all of these different versions floating around. Even the Beatles themselves, they have the single version, they have the album version, they have the Let It Be Naked version when they went back in the 2000s and tried to kind of un-Phil Spector it. And then, of course, Aretha Franklin's version technically being the original version, so to speak. But if anything, that lends to its idea of it being less of a record and more of just a song, like a hymn. There is no definitive version. It's a song of the people, and it kind of works for the song.
100%. And because of that sort of song of the people, it has been used in different ways through the years. It was released for the Sun newspaper's Ferry Aid campaign in 1987 after the Zeebrugge disaster, where a ferry capsized, killing 193 people. Paul provided permission and the 1969 vocals for the first verse, when he was joined by Boy George, Mark Knopfler, and Kate Bush, and other stars of the time. So it's used as a charity single. It was sang at Live Aid. Paul closed the show in the UK, Live Aid, with everyone coming on stage. David Bowie and Bono, all the stars of the time, are there singing Let It Be with him. Billy Joel has sang it on a live album where Paul came on and did a duet at Shea Stadium. Dolly Parton did it in 2023, where she asked for permission, and Paul went, "I'll give you more than permission. I'll come and play piano on it, and I'll bring my friend Ringo." So there's a sort of Beatles reunion on Dolly Parton's album. And to go to the impact of the song, to wrap this up, they'd all gone their separate way by this time. When it was released, John Lennon's instant Karma, We All Shine On, was in the charts. And a month after it was released, the Beatles sort of dissolved with the newspaper headline that Paul had quit the Beatles. It got, the day after, it got to number 1 in the US as well. So I think people took the message and went out and paid for that message to get a little bit of the Beatles history of that last ever record, although I think they would go to release The Long and Winding Road in the US afterwards. But it won a Grammy, and it even won an Oscar for Best Original Song Score. But no Beatle attended the ceremony, and Quincy Jones accepted on their behalf. But David, for your sort of closing remarks of the song, what has sort of been the impact and the message and the sort of the legacy of Let It Be?
It's hard to put one song up as sort of the iconic Beatles track, but I definitely think Let It Be is one of the candidates for that. Weirdly nowadays you don't seem to hear the Beatles that much on the radio, but if you do hear them, it often is this track, and there definitely is just a universal appeal to this track. It was one of the very first songs I learned on the piano for the same reasons we were discussing earlier. It's accessible, and if anything, it's just a masterclass in conveying that message, because that chorus is literally just let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. There will be an answer. Let it be. It's simple. You barely have to speak English to get the message.
And while the song, maybe not the song, but the album certainly received criticism, which we'll probably go into another time, this is sort of a perfect send-off for them. It's their epitaph in a way. And Paul McCartney has always said that he's very proud that the Beatles advocated for peace and love and positive messages, which I suppose this song is. And while it might be, to some, sickly sweet, I believe it's been described as Hey Jude without the emotional impact by one quite harsh critic. But it is something that I can sort of see is that it is a great song. Don't get me wrong, it's universal. It's sort of one of the canon of 20th century music or world music ever throughout history. However, I can understand that for some fans, this might be a little bit one step towards Paul McCartney's sort of side, that too far for some. I don't completely subscribe to that, but I do understand their view.
Yeah, it's starting to leave the Beatles sound behind. It's perhaps closer in sound to maybe I'm Amazed, which was also being penned and practiced around the same time, and that also almost was a Beatles song. So maybe if the Beatles had kept going, this sound would have become more of their direction, the sound we now associate with early Paul McCartney solo records.
Well, I don't think John Lennon would have allowed that particularly.
That's true.
But thank you very much for listening to Unbeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell today. We thoroughly enjoyed discussing Let It Be. Now join us next time to discuss Hey Bulldog, the 1968 hidden gem. Don't forget to subscribe, like and comment to Unbeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you the next time we're out.
See you next time.